Let's see.
Kind of a big deal because it's the day before pub day.
Yeah.
Which is like, I mean, they got the
Verboten,
boxes
right?
with
You're
the
not
big
allowed
chains
to even
on
open
them.
them before pub day. You guys are getting this one day before anyone else in the world.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight to the Poison Pen. You know, as they were saying, I guess you guys wouldn't be here together if it wasn't for Barbara, who the owner of the store, who's a force to be reckoned with. Hey, Barbara. And unfortunately, she's not here tonight. But I'm stepping in at the last minute here. But I just wanted to give you guys the intro that you deserve. Don Bentley is the New York Times best-selling author of 8 books, including the Matt Drake thriller series, the most recent of which is The Forgotten War. The Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. series, Weapons Grade is the new one. And beginning in 2024, well, I'll let him tell you. Don spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, during which time he was stationed in South Korea, Germany, and Texas. While deployed to Afghanistan as a troop commander in support of Operation Enduring Freedom 6, Don was awarded the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal with V device for valor. Following his time in the military, Don worked as an FBI special agent and was a member of the Dallas office Special Weapons and Tactics team. As if that wasn't enough, after leaving the FBI, Don worked for companies that developed technology for the U.S. Special Operations community. He holds a BS in electrical and computer engineering from the Ohio State University and an MFA in writing from Seton Hill University. And talk about two guys that have both sides of the brain fully functioning, both lobes. Thing here.
I love that. It's like, then he saved an African village from giant lizards.
Exactly. Kyle Mills is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 23 thrillers, including Code Red, Total Power, Lethal Agent, and Red War for Vince Flynn, and The Patriot Attack for Robert Ludlum. I'm kind of freestyling here. A bureau kid, he initially found inspiration from his father, the former director of Interpol, and still draws on his contacts in the intelligence community to give his book such realism. Kyle, you can correct me if this is wrong, but Kyle gave up a corporate gig in Baltimore, ultimately making his way west to Wyoming. Rock climbing and furniture building were important steps along the path to becoming a writer. Avid outdoor athletes, he and his wife split their time between Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Granada, Spain. So please help me give a nice warm welcome to Don Bentley and Kyle Mills.
Well, thank you for having us. How many of y'all have come to see Kyle before? Yeah, a bunch of people, some shaking their heads. Okay, so you are in luck because this is Kyle's final time with Vince Flynn. Final time. Now he'll be back here again, I'm sure, with his next book, but final time for Vince Flynn. So what I thought would be cool is that we're going to change things up a little bit. We're going to talk about the book, but we're also going to talk about Vince Flynn writ large, kind of Kyle's thing. And what I want is for y'all to help me with questions and stuff. And so I've got some things to move the conversation along, but just think of this as a shooting gallery and Kyle is your target. And so if you have a question, if he's not in tears by the end of this interview, you have not done your job. Is everybody okay with that?
How many of y'all have come out to see Don Bentley before?
One. Thank you. Thank you for coming. No, thank you so much for being here. And then folks online too as well. Patrick is always awesome about getting comments and questions and stuff, so make sure you send those in. So I wanted to set the stage. How many people have read every single book in the Vince Flynn series? Yeah, a bunch of people? Have. Yeah, have. Oh, yeah, let's shame people. Who hasn't read everybody? Shame! No, there's time for you. So in this series, there are 22 books, 13 by Vince, and of those 13, so there's one that's sort of I guess you call Term Limits kind of a standalone. So a standalone and then 2 prequels, right? And then Kyle has now written 9, so not quite what Vince did, but almost that many. And so what I want to start with, we're going to talk Code Red first. I'm really buzzing. Is that annoying y'all? Okay. We're going to talk Code Red first and then go into kind of a little bit about you and Vince and stuff like that. But starting with Code Red, we're going to kick this off by asking the one question that every writer is actually terrified to answer. You guys ready for this? What is the book about?
Asymmetrical warfare. I'm kind of interested in Russia's ability to kind of muck about in the world and to do it on the cheap. Not so much in Ukraine. Obviously, they kind of screwed up there. But I wanted to think of a way that they could attack the West and the United States in a very effective way that they're capable of doing with their resources. And they've been good at this, with Facebook propaganda and messing around with elections and things like that, but I needed to find a new weapon. I also wanted to have kind of do an old school thriller, Mitch Rapp thriller. I wanted him back in the Middle East, doing what he does best, where he's comfortable operating. And I've kind of taken him out of his comfort zone for a while. And I wanted to also create, a book that the next author could launch off of in any direction they wanted to, because I didn't want to sort of hem them in. And so that was kind of the goal here, to just do a kind of a kick-ass very Vince Flynn thriller that would be really action-packed and have a lot of Mitch's Mitchisms, really, just that he's such a fun character to play with.
Yeah, and you succeeded in that in spades for sure. Y'all are gonna love this book, and and so I do get to take over after Kyle. So next year, if you come back, it'll be me. And I think Kyle, he tried to make my life as difficult as possible with this book. So to all of you who are asking, are you scared? Yes, I'm terrified. So what I want to start with, though, is what makes a Vince Flynn book is Mitch Rapp, right? And so I think all of us who write in this genre owe something of our protagonists to Vince Flynn and Mitch Rapp. And so one of the things that's hard about writing a Mitch Rapp book, you and I talked about this a little bit before, is how do you challenge Mitch? How do you present him with something he hasn't seen before, but still have him stay true to who he is? And so in this case, you actually start off by having him work for a drug dealer. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I always want to do something different with Mitch, because he's become very real to me. More real than any character I created on my own, I think, because we've all known him since he was, just graduating from college, and I've never written a character for that long. So how is he going to react? And I never have any idea. So I throw something at him like, oh, you've got to go to Russia because they're invading, Ukraine and the Baltics, or you've got to go down to South and Central America where you don't speak the language and you don't really understand who the players are, because he's very comfortable in the Middle East. And so this was the idea, was that he owes from a prior book a favor to a cartel leader, and the cartel leader calls it in, and he says he's having problems essentially with his business interests in Syria, but he doesn't have anybody that's an expert in that area. And who does he call? Well, Mitch Rapp. He's good at operating in the Middle East, but then Mitch has to really represent him, a cartel, as opposed to the CIA or American interests. And the guy makes it very clear that basically, I gave you information that saved your girlfriend's life, and now you work for me. And so he has to navigate those waters while he's also in the Middle East, where he's comfortable, but he's not comfortable with his role there. So it's always fun to see how he's going to react to these things. And like I said, I'm never sure until I start writing the book.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Kyle does so well is he bridges that gap. So if you look at traditional crime fiction or TV shows, if you look at something like Breaking Bad, right? So what happens is you watch these characters slowly devolve, right? They become, and so Mitch Rapp, on the other hand, no matter what circumstances, even if he's working for a drug dealer, he's still going to figure out a way to do it and be noble in the end, right? And I think one of the ways that Kyle sets this up is what I call Mitch Moments, which are these very entertaining parts in the book where you get to see Mitch's character revealed. And so I'm going to read one for you, and to set this up for you, this takes place in the middle of Afghanistan, and it's from Scott Coleman's point of view. He's in an overwatch position watching Mitch, and Mitch has walked into a campfire circle where there are a bunch of Taliban guys that want to kill him. And so what Kyle writes is, Coleman swore quietly. The truth was that Rapp didn't have much more than 30 seconds of charm on his best day. The chances of getting those locks open before Rapp got irritated and shot someone was right around 0. And so when you do that, does that happen organically? Do you think about how you're going to display Mitch? Like, how do those Mitch moments come out when you write them?
I love describing Mitch from other people's points of view because everybody sees him differently. You know, Anna, essentially a 7-year-old, just thinks he's kind of an idiot, right? She's not afraid of him and all this, so she can describe him. You know, Claudia can describe him, and Scott, I think, has a really interesting point of view because he probably knows him from a combat situation better than anybody, and he's got this really wry sense of humor. So yeah, these are the things that define Mitch and show that he's always trying to do the right thing, but sometimes his impulses get in the way, or his need to get things done in the most linear fashion get in the way, but he tries to rein himself in. And I think as he gets older and wiser, that becomes a stronger need in him to try to always do what's right, to protect the country and all these things. But as time goes on, what's right and what's wrong becomes a little more blurred than it was, I don't know, even 10 years ago when Vince passed away. So it becomes a little more challenging, which you're gonna figure out.
Thanks, Kyle. So it's interesting too when you look at the books that Vince wrote, and you know that The Last Man was the last book he finished or really wrote before he died, before he passed away. And we're going to talk a little bit about what you got from him. And so knowing that and knowing that he was sick, you can kind of go back and read his books and think, what must he have been thinking as an author, right? What must he have been struggling with, and how did it affect his writing? And so for you, you're certainly, thankfully, not dying of cancer, but you knew before you were going to write this book that it was going to be your last book in the series, correct?
To some extent, yeah. Oath of Loyalty, honestly, kind of felt like it wrapped up my era a little bit. A lot of people sent me emails saying, what a great series. You wrapped it up so nicely. I've really enjoyed reading it. And me saying, wait a minute, it's not over. I have one more on my contract. So at that point, I definitely started thinking maybe it's time to do something different and let somebody else put their kind of spin on Mitch Rapp. So at that point, yeah, I started thinking a little bit about what would the next author want, because it wasn't what I got. Let me tell you, when I wrote the first book, Vince had written a book that was clearly meant to arc over into the next book. The story had not ended, and he killed the bad guy. So it was a really difficult thing to pick up. And I thought, I'm not going to do that to whoever the next guy is. But I didn't know it was Don, because I had this idea when I found out that I should write the last chapter and then say, and then Mitch lost a leg and began questioning his sexuality. But I found out too late, because you and I actually had the infamous dinner here.
We did, another Barbara.
And I knew I was leaving, and he had gotten a call to take it over. So I lied about leaving, and he lied about having gotten a call. So he thought I was getting fired and didn't know it, and like freaked out. But we were just both sitting there right across from each other for an hour, just lying
to each other.
Wasn't it announced the next day?
It was like soon after, yeah.
Barbara saying, those guys,
And that was the other part. We had to deal with the wrath of Barbara, because as soon as it was announced, I got the call, and she's like, how dare you come here and not tell me? But I'm an FBI agent. I'm pretty good, or was pretty good at reading people. And I swore, I came back and told my agent, I'm like, you need to tell him I'm not going to take this job because Kyle is getting fired. He doesn't know that he's, and so we sat and lied to each other over dinner, which was the start of our relationship.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
y'all, at the end of Enemy of the Gates, right, there was this amazing moment where Mike Nash is killed. That blew me away. Was there anybody else that it completely, right? Yeah, people are raising their hands. So what I thought you did so well there is when you write series like this, you're tempted to try and be episodic because it's easy, and you know people show up for it everywhere, and you had to know when you killed off Mike Nash, number one, there's going to be fallout from that, and number two, it limits you as a writer because you can't bring him back. Like, talk a little bit about what it's like to make big changes in a series like that.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying because when I first started, I killed Stan Hurley and I killed Gould because I thought I'm gonna, I didn't understand those two characters fully. I didn't understand Gould's relationship with Mitch, and I didn't understand how Stan at like 86 years old could still be like leaping through windows. And I thought, and then I was like, oh my God, I'm the author. I'm just going to kill them. And so that took care of that problem. But the Mike Nash thing happened really organically. It was interesting to see people's reaction to that because a lot of people felt like, Mike was just the worst guy in the world and he had it coming, but I didn't see him at all that way. I saw him as a guy who had been backed into a corner and was doing the best he could. He knew Mitch couldn't be saved, but he could save everybody else. Yeah. But Mitch was the dynamite, the sweaty dynamite in this whole situation, and he had to be gotten rid of. So I was really sympathetic to where he stood and then their relationship, and then Mitch really didn't want him dead. He just wanted to make him suffer a little bit. And I thought that was, it was a really defining moment for Mitch too. I think it really changed his character going forward, seeing that happen and knowing that he was part of that. So I thought it was really interesting, but I don't know that everybody felt that way about it. But you got to take risks.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see what you all think too. When I read that, I actually called my editor, that's my Clancy editor, and I'm like, Kyle has just changed the trajectory of this series because now it feels like anything is possible, right? Nothing is off limits, anything. And I think when you have, I guess at that point it was probably 20 books or 21 books, you have to do things like that, right?
Yeah, you do, because it does become this situation where that nothing's going to happen to Scott or Irene or, in this case, Mike. But, things can happen to him. There are stakes to these things. And yeah, I didn't know, though, honestly, I didn't say anything to anybody. I sent it to our editor and thought, I probably should have said something about it. But they thought it was, a kind of a fitting end to that character. But yeah, he was a major. It's kind of hard to knock off, Stan and Mike Nash.
So show of hands, who approved of Kyle's decision to kill Mike Nash? Who approved of Kyle's decision to kill Stan Hurley?
Come on, Stan went out the way he wanted to.
Okay, so for those of you online, the comment was that Stan and Louis went together was justice. I'll give you that. That was good.
Stan went the way he wanted to. He didn't want to die of cancer, have old age. Yeah.
I think you did it well. Now
one of my favorite scenes though was with Scott couldn't stand him in the fridge, and had to sit him up and put a cigarette and a drink in his hand. He'd stand seeing him there.
So now we're gonna psychoanalyze Kyle a little bit.
Oh, God.
So knowing, like I said, that you at some point you realized this was going to be your last book, or was probably going to be your last book, there are some really poignant things I think you say here. And so the first one is from Mitch's point of view, and the quote is, "More and more he felt like it was time to circle the wagons, to bring the few people he cared about inside and keep everyone else out." So if he does that, that makes it kind of hard for me going forward. But what were you thinking when you wrote that? What were you trying to get across? Why put that in?
I think the world has really changed since I took over the series, and a lot of the challenges are complex. They're internal. They're about, a lot of the rancor inside the United States, and these are things that he struggles with, and they're not a thing that can be solved by a guy with a Glock. So he's starting to get a little more introspective about what he can and cannot do, and what he's prepared to do. And that's what I was trying to get across there. I mean, not to make your life difficult, but I think that he's just becoming older and a little more introspective, like all of us do. I've had him for a decade, so while I don't age him physically at the same rate as, it's not 1 year a book or anything, I do age him to some extent emotionally, and a lot has happened to him in those 10 years.
So I'm gonna break the cardinal rule of interviewing the author, and I'm gonna give you the last line of the book, because this was, to me, it was like a little warm heart moment, which also makes my life more difficult. But I want you to talk about this. So this is Claudia talking to Mitch at the very end of the book, and Claudia says, Irene says she doesn't have anything for you on the horizon, and the guys don't have another contract starting till fall. Does that mean you're home for a while? He tied the duffel that Anna had forgotten about and slung it over his shoulder. For a while, yeah. And that's how the book ends.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking like a domestic thriller. You're welcome.
Asymmetrical threat.
Asymmetrical threat. So you're an amazing writer, and when you're a good writer, the story comes first, and the themes and stuff get built on afterwards. Was that something you wanted to do as part of the plot? Was that part of your going away? Did it become that? Like, how did those lines come about?
Yeah, I mean, it was me leaving and wanting to leave it pretty open. You've got Mitch at home. You've got, Coleman's got contracts. He can go back to Irene. And so I really wanted to leave it on, I mean, not it's this incredibly action-packed, like bloody book, but to leave it on a note that Mitch gets to go home finally to his family and kick back for a minute and, think about what's happened and where he's going to go in the future, and what his part and his role in the new world is, the world we live in today. And that's, that's the Bentley era.
The domestic thriller era, thanks to Kyle Mills. One more thing about the book before we jump into some broader stuff. So the driving force in Code Red is a drug. And so I want you to talk a little bit about the drug itself, how much is real, how much is made up, and why you settled on that as kind of your threat vector for Code Red.
Yeah, so the drug is Captagon. Everything I said about it's real. You don't really need to make anything up. And that is a drug that's very popular in the Middle East. It's been a huge driver of funding for terrorists, particularly ISIS, and a huge driver in fighting, in that they get amped up on it and kind of go till they drop. And now it's mostly manufactured by the Syrian government, which is, Syria's become a bit of a narco state now. And so that's what I wanted to explore. So I was talking about asymmetrical warfare, and I wanted to come up with a new weapon. And I was kind of thinking about it, like I was a Russian. It's one of the fun things about being a writer, a thriller writer, is you get to be the villain, right? So I was thinking, what's American, what's the West's weaknesses? So I started going through them in my mind. And one of them is, the fentanyl crisis. And so I thought, what if I, being the Russian, developed a drug that was purposely dangerous, like incredibly addictive, really caused permanent damage to people that took it, and things like that, that it could sweep through the West, put in incredible strain on us politically, culturally, financially. And that would be, in my mind, something the Russians would devise. And so Captagon was the the perfect place for it because it's manufactured in Syria, very much the Russian sphere of influence, and not a very difficult thing to do. I mean, the stuff I wrote about it being permanently damaging, that there are drugs that they've discovered are that way. Captagon really was a pharmaceutical until it became apparent that it was extremely addictive. And so I just sort of took some different little threads. They're all real and combined them in a way that they haven't been combined, fortunately, in the real world.
Yeah, and it was really well done. Obviously, the book's called Code Red, and so you think there's going to be a Russian influence but it took me a while to put that together. And so from you're famous, or maybe infamous from a process standpoint about the level of detail you do in outlines, stuff like that, before you actually start writing. And so maybe walk people through a little bit of what your process is when you sit down to write a Mitch Rapp book.
Yeah, any book I do, I write really elaborate outlines. So people probably don't think about it, but a book may be 100,000 words, like a Mitch Rapp book, around 100,000 words, and I'll write an outline that's 30,000 words maybe. So I know where I'm going, and there's a ton of research in there, but I don't necessarily follow it because I need to know everything about what's going on, where'd that character go to high school? How is Captagon formulated? Where is it made? How is it transported? All those things, but they don't necessarily make it into the book. But it has to feel real to me. Sometimes it's writings about what you leave out. So that's my process, is to make this world very real. I have a bit of a plotting thought process, so I kind of start with an idea, then slowly build on it. I always wanted to be one of those eureka writers that's like, I've come up with a brilliant idea and I've worked out the whole book in my head in the last 5 minutes. And there are people like that, but it's not me. So the way I think of things is, here's the problem. What would really happen? Like if this Captagon was coming across, it was very dangerous, what would the world do? What would the CIA do? What would the Europeans do? So that's how I build on it. And a lot of times the book kind of writes itself, in the sense that, if you're faced with a real threat, there are real reactions to it throughout the world.
So let's transition a little bit and talk about kind of your career writ large and how you came into the Flynn universe. So you've written 21 books, 9 of them for Vince Flynn, 3 for the Bourne universe, and 11 of your own. And so you're one of the unique folks who have written for multiple legacy series. So I guess talk a little bit about how you got the opportunity to write the first one in the Bourne universe.
Yeah, that was just kind of a strange thing. I just got a call saying that they had written, or they had a very science-y series that Ludlum had done, and they wanted to reboot it. And they had read a book I'd written called Darkness Falls that had a very science-y bent. I'm kind of a science geek, always have been. And they said, gee, that's right. That's kind of like what we're going for, was Darkness Falls. Would you like to write some of these Ludlum series, reboot this series? Well, this was really before this was a thing for the most part. And I said, well, that just seems like a stupid idea, and kind of hung up on them. But then, I was a huge Ludlum fan. That's what I grew up on, Ludlum, Tom Clancy, people like that. And I thought, wow, it'd be really fun. It's a cool series. It was, such an admirer. The idea of thinking about how Ludlum wrote, one of my heroes, and trying to emulate that. And so in the end, I thought, yeah, maybe that'd be fun to do a book. And I ended up doing 3. And they were a blast because it was more science-y than something I would have done probably on my own, for my own brand. And it I had these ideas in my head. And like one of them was a zombie book. And I thought, I'm going to write a zombie book, but I'm not going to tell them. And I did, and they never noticed. That is just like a flat-out zombie book. Nobody ever noticed.
And so then did you go straight from Bourne to Flynn, or did you write?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was writing my own book, and then...
And so how did that happen?
Yeah, that was really weird because I remember...
Did you lie to somebody as part of that process?
Yes, man. No, I was probably too honest, really. Yeah, I still remember the day, that my wife called me from work and said, oh my God, Vince Flynn died. And I had known he was sick, but I hadn't known he was that ill. And it was really devastating. I was a huge fan of the series. Vince had helped me out in my career. And, but I remember a few days later kind of being a little selfish and thinking, wow, but in The Last Man, it just sort of leaves it hanging. I mean, I at least want Mitch to like be blown up in a fiery, car crash, right? Like something, or finish it and he decides to retire and play golf or whatever. I mean, whatever it is, it can't just be
domestic thriller.
Yeah, domestic thriller. He gets married, plays golf, right? Gets fat. And I thought, I hope that at the very least he finished it, the last book, and it was, we'll get that, or they hire somebody to finish it and finish out the series. And I don't know, it's like a few weeks later, I got a call saying, have you ever considered, writing the Vince Flynn series? And I thought, no. No. I mean, I really, I've never read those books like an author. I read them as a fan. So I kind of panicked and said, well, I'm going to have to go back and read The Last Man again and see if I think this is something I could do, if I could credibly do it. Because he and I had really different writing styles. So I reread The Last Man, kind of came up with some ideas of where it could go and talked to them. But, you and I are very similar this way, in that I was like, yeah, this is my idea, but I probably won't do it in the end, because it's funny, come up with these great ideas in the shower and then you write them down and they look stupid on the page. So I thought, well, I'm not going to get that job. And they called me back and said, sure, that'd be fine. So, but I mean, it obviously, it wasn't that bad. I came across, I was a huge fan. I knew all the characters and like where they had been and where they should go. And you can't do this with them. You can't do that. So, I think they felt like, I really I really knew the series and loved the series and wanted to continue it as opposed to try to change it, which is exactly the way I felt.
And then once you said yes, you were under the impression that perhaps there was more that existed in the to be written book than actually was. So talk about that.
Yeah, that was stupid on my part. So when I write a book, and we just talked about it, I write these really long outlines. Until I ever write a page, I mean, I have the whole book worked out. And they had sent me 3 pages of the book, the first 3 pages of the book. And that's all he had written. So I said, I had the 3 pages and I said, great, take the job, have Lisa, his wife, send me the stuff. And they said, well, what stuff? And I said, well, go to his office. He's going to outline his computer. He's going to have a big box of research. It's going to be the stuff, And they said, oh, no, there's no stuff. Vince just likes to, just sit down and start banging it out. And that's what he banged out, those 2.5 pages. I thought, oh my God. So I had to do the whole thing with those pages, from scratch, like figure out where the characters were going to go. Like I said, he had killed the bad guy, and there's nothing worse than reading a thriller with no bad guy in it. So, I had to try to reconstruct that and everything, but it was an incredible challenge. And, I do love a challenge, honestly. Like, can I do this? And, I had a lot of fun with it, though. I sweated it out, let me tell you.
So one of the challenges when you take over a legacy series is that you can't write like Vince. Right? Nobody can write like Vince any more than somebody could write like you, but you want to honor what he created in the universe that he created. And so as you'd already written for your own stuff, written for Bourne, and then as you're coming to Vince's world, what were some changes that you consciously made, either to your writing style or how you approached it or whatever for Vince?
Yeah, I mean, I made a lot of changes. Like I said, I didn't write anything like Vince, which is kind of funny that they called me. I thought, have you ever read one of my books? But I probably shouldn't say that because then they might. I never wrote long action sequences. I had, tended to be like really complex investigations. My characters were a little ambiguous. They were never totally good or totally bad. So it was, I mean, in a way, I think it worked for me because you can really feel yourself falling into your own voice if it's that different than Vince's. So my goal was to very much change my style to the way Vince wrote, not to write a Kyle Mills novel with Mitch Rapp in it. I think that wouldn't work. He's not a character maybe that I probably would have created. If anybody read these books, there's a character I created named Grisha Azarov, and he's much more the type of character that I would write in my own books. So what I wanted to do was essentially create a forgery, to really, under the idea that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I mean, Vince's books weren't broke, so you didn't really want to go off on too much of a tangent. So I really wanted to write the book that he would have written, like to follow up The Last Man. And I thought about that with every sentence. Is that a sentence he would have written? Is that a character? Is this a plot line? And so probably the only thing I changed consciously is I have a hard time writing a book that doesn't have any humor in it. And he didn't have a lot of humor in his books. He was a funny guy, but he didn't write it into his books. So that was the one thing I did because I feel like it breaks my tension. I don't know about the readers, but I need it,
So over the course of 9 books, the series starts to become yours and Vince's, right? There's definitely, even though you're honoring what Vince did, you can't help but put your mark on it because you're writing. What would you say, and this word may sound too pretentious, and I don't mean it that way, but like, what would you say is your contribution to the series, or the thing that you feel like you have given to the series over 9 books?
I think, well, I mean, he would have done this too, but I think I moved it more into the current context because these were very much books about Islamic terrorism, which makes sense because that's what was happening at the time that Vince was writing them. And I consciously transitioned them into something different. You had the rise of Russia, you have China, you have all the, the infighting in the United States and all these things. And I tried to capture that and move away from the straight terrorism stuff.
So you talked, I can't remember if I heard you say this in an interview or you and I were talking about it before. Like, one of your learning points was, and I apologize, I can't remember which book it was, that you realized you hadn't given enough screen time to Mitch, that you had spent more time with the antagonist, and kind of talk them through that process and how you had to learn that.
Yeah, so that was a funny book. That was Red War, which, interesting, a woman just told me, that got her back into reading. She had stopped reading and read Red War, and I thought, it seemed really gratifying. But yeah, with Red War, I got a certain amount of pushback from fans, and I couldn't understand why. So I read reviews and stuff, and it was funny. Nobody was really wanted to say it was a bad thriller novel. They just didn't think it was a good Mitch Rapp thriller novel. And in the end, what it was is you had 3 separate stories there, and you had Mitch Rapp, you had Grisha Azarov, and you had the president of Russia. And they weren't that related. Like, they weren't necessarily related to Mitch, because the president of Russia was dying of brain cancer, so that was his main problem. Mitch Rapp was secondary problem, and Grisha Azarov just wanted to retire with his surfer girlfriend to Costa Rica and smoke weed. And really, that was his main goal. He didn't care about Mitch Rapp one way or the other. He just wanted to move on. And so I learned from that Mitch is really fundamental to these books, and that he's the thing that everything rotates around. And I really hadn't fully understood that, because people look back, and we were talking about this earlier today, they look back on these books but don't and remember them just like we all do, in a way that's maybe not entirely factual. So that, like, for instance, that all the books start with big action sequences. Vince actually never started a book with an action sequence. That he never swears in his books. Well, let me just tell you, as a guy who has his Word documents and I can search them, he very much did. So and that Mitch was always absolutely central to these books, which is also not true. So, but that's the way it evolved, and that's what I felt like people wanted in the end, and what I hopefully provided.
So let's do one more, and then we can open it up for questions. So you kind of led me to your next one. When people were asking you why you were retiring, and you said, "Hey, I wanna write this story about Fade," which was a character of a book you'd written a while ago, and you said you couldn't do it in the Vince Flynn world because Mitch is the captain of his own destiny, and you just said the world revolves around Mitch. So knowing that, how do you write a book where there's something big enough to challenge someone who just being on stage kind of warps things to their own benefit just being there?
I think it's just a different, it's just a different kind of thriller. I mean, I always think of the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales when I think of Mitch Rapp, and you never really think anybody's going to kill Josie Wales. You're just interested to see how he, how he's going to survive and kill all of them. So it's a little bit of a different kind of structure than a book that might be a one-off where maybe the protagonist could be killed off or whatever. So I think that's fun. It's like the old saying is nobody wants to watch Superman bleed, and that's kind of true, I think, in these novels, which is a little different than my Fade novel, in which he definitely bled.
All right, it's your turn. And I have books to bribe you. So the first three people who ask get a book. Yes, sir.
Thank you. First of all, both of you, thank you for your service. And also for both of you, how are you going to approach the Lee Child's problem? He's got this great character. He gets put on a movie, and they cast a guy that's 5'4".
But not anymore.
Yeah. The new Reacher guy is incredible.
But I mean, Mitch can't possibly be 5'4".
No, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I liked American Assassin. I thought Dylan did a really good job of portraying Mitch when he was like 20. He would have been 23 years old. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. But I remember they were talking about Chris Hemsworth for that role, and I said, well, but he's like blonde. And I mean, the whole point of Mitch Rapp is he can move through Arab countries and be unnoticed and all this stuff. Like Chris Hemsworth would definitely struggle with that.
Looks like a Viking.
Yeah, but Vince I think was very wise with the movies, and he once said, let me try to remember it exactly. Hollywood is like a wall, and you throw your book over and they throw a bag of money over, and that's the entire transaction. So I think that's probably a certain amount of wisdom. Tom Clancy did it different. He'd get really mad about his movies.
Yeah, and then badmouth them in the press if he didn't like them.
So, so I feel like that's my philosophy on this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, in the black shirt. Go ahead. I'll get you next, buddy.
Well, you answered one of my questions because I was going to ask, did you get any information after the last stand? So that's a challenge to get 2 damn pages. But I guess I have 2 questions. One, did you ever consider writing and kind of filling in the 10-year big gap that seems you kind of imagine? A lot of opportunity there. And then they always talked and hinted about they were still training people at the farm, all that kind of stuff. Any thought about maybe having somebody, because obviously Scott can't replace him from Mitch. So any thought about having him kind of training somebody else to kind of.
Yeah. So the first part is filling in that gap. Yeah. I mean, to me, so Kill Shot's, Consent to Kill is probably my favorite Vince Flynn book, but Kill Shot's my second. And, it was clearly supposed to be a trilogy, and I did want to fill that in, but I didn't get a lot of traction. Nobody said no, but I didn't feel like there was a lot of excitement with the publisher. So I didn't do it. But it's funny because in my head, like I know what happened to Greta and how he and Stan became close and all this stuff, but I've never written it down.
Maybe you could pass that knowledge
Yeah, sure,
along.
yeah. I'll send you an email. And as far as like somebody training somebody younger, it's an interesting idea, but I got to tell you, we just talked about this. Like there is zero appetite for retiring Mitch and not having him be really central to these books. So I've hinted at that in a few books, and I just don't feel like fans were up for it. So no, but maybe you can.
We'll see.
We'll see. We'll see.
In the red shirt, I think, buddy. Do you have a question? When did we first get interested in reading?
For me, like first grade, see Dick run. I couldn't wait to find out where he was running to and what Spot was going to do. And yeah, I mean, I've always been a huge reader. And to me, I like movies, okay, but I would say they're nothing to me compared to reading a book.
Yeah, I'd say my mom did a great job reading to me when I was a kid. And when I was in second or third grade, and she may have done this on purpose because my mom's a really smart lady, but she was reading me some kind of mystery, and it got to the real pivotal part, and she put it down, and she's like, I have to go do something. And so it sat there, and I looked at it for a while, and it sat there, and I grabbed it and picked it up and started reading it myself. And so I've always been a huge reader, but I remember that moment, it going from her reading to me to me reading myself.
Don, you've tactfully avoided talking about your new book.
Oh, is there another book here?
There is a book
Look
here.
at that.
Tell us what's going on in Weapons Grade.
Yeah, so it's my last Tom Clancy book, and so my third Tom Clancy book was called Flashpoint, and it was this really big book. So typically Jack Ryan Jr. books, the one I write, are smaller focused. It's on, obviously, Jack Ryan Jr., and it's usually Jack wanders off somewhere and gets in trouble. And so I wrote this really big book in Flashpoint that spans across the globe, and you see, Mary Pat and Jack Ryan Sr. and everything. And when my editor got it, he said, man, you've actually written a Jack Ryan Sr. book. This isn't a junior book. And so when I sat down to write this one, I told my editor, I'm like, I just want to write a small book. And so my son, I live in Texas. My son goes to Texas A&M, and so we drive through to go see him, all these little Texas towns. And every one of these towns has a Dairy Queen, a barbecue spot, and a brand new bank. And I'm like, how do they have this brand new bank? And so I told my editor, I'm like, I'm going to write about Jack Ryan Jr. being in this small Texas town and bad things happening to him. And he said, so it'll kind of be like Jack Reacher in Texas. And I'm like, exactly. And so I went to write this book, and about a month before it's due, my editor comes back and he's like, okay, we got to settle on a cover and a name, and here are some covers I have of little Texas towns. And I said, well, about that. The book is actually now about the Iranians achieving nuclear breakout and so there is still an element of a small Texas town that kind of happens together. And so I'm also a huge aviation geek, and so I grew up like most aviation geeks do, seeing the SR-71 Blackbird. It's the airplane that still is the fastest air-breathing airplane, even though it has been retired for 50 years. And I said, wouldn't it be cool to have that in the book? And I thought, I'm the freaking author. I can put it in the book. And so I actually found a guy. His name is Major General Bob Beeler, who was an SR-71 pilot. And I spent an hour and a half on the phone with him. And by the end, I'm like, can I make you a character in this book? And he said, yes, you can. And so he is actually in it. And I get to bring the SR-71 back and do a whole bunch of just fun stuff. So it is, again, a big book that has part of it happening in a little town in Texas, and also some bad things happening all over the world.
So did it start really small? Like were you like, oh yeah, and then there's going to be a murder?
Yeah.
And then and then it just kept
It
exploding?
did, and I kept, the way I work, like Kyle, so no matter which way you write, you have to do the work either in the beginning like Kyle does, or in me, what happens is you figure out more of the story as you go along, which means you have to do a lot more rewriting at the end. And so I'm writing about this thing going down in Texas, and I'm like, this just feels too small. I'm missing something. And the entire time I'm reading about hypersonics and hypersonic missiles and hypersonic airplanes. And suddenly I saw kind of how those two things could come together. And so at first it was more of a Jack Reacher book, and then it turned into something else.
What's going on in Drake's world?
So I also get to write my Matt Drake series. So the fourth book of that, this year's been a little bit crazy for me. So this is my third book that's come out this year. So my fourth book in my Matt Drake series came out in April. My third Clancy book came out in June, and now this one just came out last week. And so my fourth Matt Drake book was called Forgotten War. It took place during the withdrawal of Afghanistan. I had served in Afghanistan. It was something very personal to me, and so it was a very personal book to write. And so he right now is anxiously waiting for me to finish my first Mitch Rapp book so we can figure out what happens to Matt. So right now I'm only working on my first Mitch Rapp book, but I hope to change that up in a little bit.
So where are you in it?
In my Mitch Rapp
book, yeah.
So it starts with Mitch Rapp waking up and realizing all of Kyle's books were a dream. So that is, yeah. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
You were speaking about Chris Hemsworth. Have you seen Extraction?
Yeah, I have.
He's got, I think there's two of them, Extraction 1 and 2, and he's in the Middle East. And hair is easy to go from blonde to whatever. So
He just does not look Arab to me.
he
in
doesn't look Arab, but you know that's why they got scarves and everything else.
Yeah.
It's
No,
something to
I
consider.
I hear you.
You
I
know?
hear you.
It's just a thought.
I have this mental picture of what Mitch Rapp looks like in my head, and it honestly a lot like Dylan.
Yeah,
Did,
I
you
actually
know,
thought he did a
he
really good
looked-
job
yeah.
too.
Yeah, he has gotten older.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I know when I wrap up a good job, right, and I turn to the next person, I say, "Don't fuck up." What did you say?
When he got done lying to me or before?
I mean, you know, you have to have a conversation, you know, of the elephant in the room, right? So
We haven't really fully had that conversation yet. This is probably over the next 3 days we're traveling together. We're gonna have the don't fuck up conversation.
And it is. I got that conversation from Mike Madden when I took over the Jack Ryan Jr. and Mark Graney, and I say that tongue in cheek because the neat thing about this genre is how supportive all the other authors are, and that everybody's pulling for you, everybody's trying to help you out. I can't tell you the number of times Mark Graney would get on the phone with me to talk Jack Ryan stuff, and you didn't get much from Vince, but you created a whole heck of a lot over the last 9 books.
So yeah, I had taken all these notes and everything from the series. I'd read the entire series again in chronological order, and taken all the notes and everything. So I had a pretty firm grasp on all the characters in the universe and stuff. So that I can still pass on. You have to remember, where was Joe Maslick from? What branch of the military was he in, and all those kinds of things. So the ages of everybody, super complicated. It took me months to figure that out. So hopefully you'll be a little bit better off than I was. And then Vince would get it mixed up. And so you'd have to decide, like, well, how old is this guy and what branch of the military he's in? You just got to pick one.
Got a question or two from the online people, if I could
Yeah.
stick those in. John would like to know, please discuss other asymmetrical threats which concern the U.S. intelligence community. What is an asymmetrical threat? By the way?
Just so it's kind of non-conventional warfare. If you can, propaganda on social media is a big one. Mucking about in elections, bribery, assassination. These are all things you can do to affect a much larger opponent, like Russia versus the United States, with very little money and very little effort. So blackmail. These are all kinds of interesting things that Russia has been able to punch above its weight by using those kinds of techniques. Now they've gotten themselves bogged down in a conventional war, which is a big mistake. But you have to continue to worry about those things because they're getting bigger. Hacking, industrial espionage, all these kinds of things are huge now, and it takes an enormous amount of resources to defend against them, but not so much to actually perpetrate them.
Yeah, there's actually, I think the doctrinal term for that is called the gray zone. And so there's actually, China does this very, very well. And so if you look at China from the influence operations they do, they have these things called Confucius Institutes, right? That for a long time they were funding, and they would dump tons of money and say to like a university, hey, we're going to give you all these grants and do all this thing, but we want to set up our own little school here that's called the Confucius Institute. Or there was another, like, you can't make this up, you'd think you'd read this in one of Kyle's books, but they had actually set up quote unquote police stations all over the world in other countries that they were using to then run operations out of. And so China's a great example of doing asymmetrical warfare to influence either opinions here in the United States, thoughts, everything from buying up crazy amounts of farmland outside of our military bases and stuff like that. It's not open warfare, it's not provocative, but it's certainly an asymmetrical threat. Yeah.
On your contract for the Mitch Rapp, is it an extended contract? You're going to be writing quite a few, maybe 10 years?
So we aren't allowed to talk about our contracts, but I will be here for a little while, I think.
Okay.
And
So is there any possibility in the future of having a Ryan, Rapp, Drake crossover? Maybe they all three meet somewhere?
I can tell you with 100% certainty there is zero potential. So each of those things, what is very valuable that each of these writers have created, Vince Flynn, Tom Clancy, is the intellectual property that is that universe, right? And so they would, yeah, I'm. Do you disagree with that?
I actually wrote a character into one of my old characters, Fade, into just a mention of him in a Mitch Rapp book. But then I thought it was really funny because there's a book in which Scott had been really badly injured, and Mike Nash was actually going through and saying these are people that can replace him temporarily, and Mitch was just giving him a super hard time. He just wanted Scott back, and he's like, well, you can't have him. And one of them was Mike. He said, well, why, Fade's available. And he's like, I'm not going to spend the next year listening to the same Go-Go's record over and over and over again. And then I deleted it.
Did you have another one online?
Yeah, I got another online one. Paul asks, let's see, Stephen King has said that he doesn't create an outline and doesn't always know the plot when he writes a novel. What is your process for writing? And you mentioned that you're quite the plotter.
Yeah, I do, but Vince didn't. Tom Clancy didn't.
Yeah, I don't either. And so when I start to write a book, I know usually what's called the inciting incident, which is kind of writer talk for, if you think about Star Wars, it's that moment in the movie where Luke Skywalker goes from being a water herder to somebody on the path to being a Jedi, right? It's that moment in time where the story shifts for the protagonist. And so for me, I'm telling myself the story as I write it. And so you ask yourself questions like, how can I raise the stakes of the story? How can I make things more difficult for the protagonist? A lot of times when I get stuck, what I'll do is go back and read what I've written before and say, like, what are the questions that haven't been answered yet? But it's really, I think for writers, it's really binary. You're one or the other. And if you're one, I wish I could outline. I've tried to outline. But it's like I get vapor lock and I'm just, I can't figure it out. And so usually it's one or the other. If you are one, you can't be the other.
Question about Fade. Is that going to be your next project, or will you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to start a series about that character. It's a character that I had written about in the past, and I've spent the last 10 years thinking about him. He's probably the most popular character I ever wrote, and he really got into my head too. So I've seen him lying there kind of just out of sight, and he's kind of a perfect guy to, I think, for the modern world and the threats, that we see today. So he's a fun guy. He's a really interesting character. And I finally just had to let him out.
Just a quick question about sort of, there's a lot of Clancy in Vince Flynn, and for writers of his generation, Clancy was the man. It's kind of cool that you're going full circle there.
Yeah, it is really neat. So Tom Clancy is the one who made me a fan of this genre. Most people cite Hunt for the Red October as the one that brought him in. For me, it was Red Storm Rising, which was, I think, his only standalone book in about, World War III, basically. But Vince really took what Clancy did and was the first writer to bring it into the War of Terror age. And so many of us who write in this genre now have some version of a protagonist that goes out and hunts bad guys and shoots them in the face. And Vince was really the first person to do that. And so it was Vince that did it, and then Brad Thor, and now you've got, Mark Graney with The Gray Man and Brad Taylor with Pike Logan. I think all of us who write in that genre owe something to Vince for what he did with Mitch Rapp.
And so on. One of the things I find interesting is I've been more attracted to Jack Ryan Jr. than Jack Ryan Sr. What about that character makes it more interesting, maybe for you?
Yeah. So his question was, why is Jack Ryan Jr. more interesting to me than Jack Ryan Sr.? I think so. Jack Ryan Sr., if you read these books, he's probably in his 60s or maybe 70s and has been president for about 20 years or so. And not in real time, but I think it's very much in order to see the kind of books that Clancy started writing when Ryan was just an analyst and he could, jump through the hatch of a submarine and get in a duel with a KGB agent. He needed some vector to be able to do that, right? He couldn't do it while Jack Ryan, and even if Jack Ryan, Senior left office, he's not going to be able to do that anymore. And so I felt like when I came to the series, I had the ability to write kind of the redheaded stepchild, if you will, over here. Like, here's this guy that is kind of a knucklehead anyway that nobody really pays attention to, and he usually goes off and does something dumb and then has to figure out how to bring things back. And so what I really started, I didn't know it was going to be a 4-book arc at the time, or that I'd only write 4 books, but I started thinking a lot is that Jack Ryan Jr., the son, is now the same age roughly as the father was when he started Hunt for the Red October, right? And so I thought, what would he be thinking about as a person? What would his insecurities be? What would he... All sons, I think, compare themselves to their fathers and look, and when you have that guy as your father, what would you think about, number one? And then number two, everybody else in the campus, those iconic characters like John Clark was a SEAL from Vietnam, Ding Chavez was an infantryman, everybody else there belongs except for Jack Ryan Jr. He's there because his last name is Ryan. And so part of what I wanted to try and do over my 4-book arc is to make him confront that and say, how do I prove that I belong here? How do I earn my place here? And so those were more like what Kyle was thinking. I think when you're writing a series, you're always walking that very fine line where you want to give the people what they showed up for, but you also have to keep the series moving or else it dies. It becomes my kids. I was a kid of the 80s, and it was fun watching my kids rediscover 80s TV, and there was this masterpiece they all found on Netflix called The A-Team. And so they watched about 4 episodes of it and quit. And I'm like, why? And they're like, Dad, the same thing happens at the same time. And I'm like, yeah, but it's great. And so I think that's what you have to be careful of when you're watching these or writing that is people show up to see Mitch Rapp. But if every book these 5 things happen, then it feels episodic. But at the same time, you don't want to stray too far from that path because that's what they're showing up for. And so that's what I tried. That's why Jack Ryan Jr. was interesting to me, because I felt like I had the room to try and explore that a little bit.
You guys talked about process a lot. What is the dialogue? Do you leave like gaps in the fact you do it? I'm always curious about that. Like, or do you just write the dialogue back and forth as you're proceeding in the book? Or
I do. I think dialogue to me is pretty easy because I hear them talking in my head. To me, it's much more the long action sequences that You have to have every detail, write diagrams of everything. And, did the guy go right or left? And what gun did he have? And how many bullets did he shoot? I found those to be like exhausting. And Vince did them 30 pages long. And probably the longest one I'd ever written was 2. And so it takes me days to work those out.
Yeah, so I was an Army officer for 10 years, and I flew Apache helicopters, and it was back in the time before there were moving map displays, before there were what they call Blue Force trackers. And so the way you understood how the battle was progressing is you would listen to radio calls, and you had to picture that in your head, or you had to be able to look at a laminated map, hear radio calls, and understand what was going on. And so for me, story always, the dialogue comes first, because the way that the characters talk and what they're saying, to me, drives the story. So like Kyle said, often my first drafts, I won't have any descriptions. I'll have to go back and add all the setting descriptions and do that, because to me, the dialogue is the story. And I hate doing all the rest of it.
Yeah, books are fundamentally about people, and that's what you're writing.
I've got one more question here from the online. Valerie asks, Don, are you privy to behind the scenes with Andrews and Wilson? Can we expect a new Katie Ryan series?
Yeah, so the Andrews and Wilson guys are taking over the Jack Ryan Sr. books for Mark Cameron, who was writing them before. And they are both naval officers. And so Brian Andrews was actually a submarine officer. And so if you've read Tom Clancy Flashpoint, there's a big sequence in there. Brian actually helped me with that. And so their idea for their first book, it's coming out, and believe it or not, I think it's the 40th anniversary of Hunt for the Red October. So that means we're all very old. And so they are writing a submarine book that's going to come out 40 years after Hunt for the Red October, and they're using a different Ryan sibling. So Katie Ryan, I think, is Jack Ryan's Jr.'s sister, and so they're actually using her. And so it's going to be pretty incredible. I actually have the Word version of that book on my Kindle. If anybody wants to read it, I'll just open it up, and just don't tell Tom Colgan. But yeah, it's going to be phenomenal.
Sorry, did you have a question right there?
I'm going to be in Austin this weekend. What is the best non-touristy thing to do in Austin? And do you have a favorite hiking trail here in Arizona?
Yeah, I really like the state park in Tucson. I can't remember its name. I'm gonna think of it.
Saguaro National Park?
No, it's the state park there.
Oh, okay.
No, Mount Lemon would be hard to hike up. No, it's not that one. It's right across from the Marriott. So look at that. But it's a big trail system right across from the Marriott. It's gonna come to me.
So I've got 3 things for you. So if you like hiking and stuff like that, Barton Springs has an incredible amount of trails and stuff, and there's actually a really neat pool there that's a natural pool. Because we're in a bookstore, Book People is an independent bookstore that's there at Austin, is incredible. And then finally, Austin is all about food. There is a food truck called Gordo's, and everything is built off a donut, and it is magical. And so you need to try Gordo's.
What about music? You got the Continental Club.
Oh yeah,
Antones.
all kinds of music everywhere in Austin. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Any other questions?
Well, maybe we should wrap it up and have you guys sign some books for us. But before we do, we always have this little tradition of giving away a book. And Barbara left me this one, Forgotten Warriors, The Long History of Women in Combat.
Oh, that's awesome.
Which looks really fascinating. So when you purchased a book, you should have a numbered ticket. You might want to pull that out and check it out. John, what's our 27? Okay. I don't have 2 gifts. I have to come up with a second one. But all right, Don, since you did such a wonderful job of kind of moderating tonight, can you pick a number between 1 and 27?
14.
Hey, well, you get the book. Awesome. All right. Well, let's give these guys a real warm round of applause. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
And if you wouldn't mind, some of you know the drill. If you just kind of fold up your chair and put it against the closest wall, and we'll line you up by numbered. Would you guys like to?